If you go to work today, you may never forgive yourself for ignoring me. Those were the words my neighbor said when he knocked on my front door at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. At the time, I thought Walter Brooks had finally lost his mind. By noon, I understood that he had been trying to save me from something I never saw coming. I'm Margaret Collins. I was 68 years old that spring, and like many people my age, my mornings followed the same routine. I woke up before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, fed my tabby cat Daisy, and got ready for another shift at the accounting office where I worked 3 days a week. It wasn't glamorous work, but after my husband passed away 7 years earlier, the extra income helped me keep the house we had built together. That morning began like every other. The sky outside was still dark. The streetlights cast long shadows across our quiet neighborhood in Cedar Grove, Ohio. I stood in my kitchen wearing a navy blue cardigan and pouring coffee into my favorite ceramic mug when the sharp sound of knocking echoed through the house. 3 quick knocks, then 3 more. I glanced at the microwave clock. 5:02 a.m. My first thought was that something terrible had happened. At that hour, nobody knocked on doors unless there was an emergency. My heart immediately began to race. I hurried to the front door and looked through the peephole. Standing on my porch was Walter. He lived next door and had for more than 20 years. He was 72, a retired firefighter with silver hair, broad shoulders, and the kind of calm demeanor that made people trust him. Yet that morning, something felt different. He looked tense, almost frightened. I opened the door. "Walter, are you okay?" He looked past me into the house before meeting my eyes. "Margaret, don't go to work today." I blinked. "What?" "Stay home." His voice was low and firm. "Just trust me." I stared at him, waiting for an explanation. None came. "Walter, what are you talking about?" He shifted his weight and glanced toward the street. "I can't explain right now." "Can't explain?" I repeated. "You woke me up at 5 in the morning to tell me not to go to work, and you can't explain?" For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say more. Then he shook his head. "Please, just stay home today." The silence between us felt strange, uncomfortable. Walter had always been practical, rational. He wasn't the type to make dramatic predictions or act on wild feelings. Yet there he stood, looking more serious than I had ever seen him. "Did something happen?" I asked. "Is someone sick?" "No, then what is this about?" Again, he hesitated. "Margaret, I'm asking you as a friend. Don't leave this house today." Then he turned and walked back toward his property without another word. I stood on my porch watching him disappear into the darkness. The cold morning air brushed against my face. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Everything seemed perfectly normal, yet a knot had formed in my stomach. At that moment, I had no idea that less than 7 hours later, a phone call would change everything. And I certainly had no idea that Walter had been awake all night, watching, waiting, and carrying a secret that would soon turn both of our lives upside down. After Walter disappeared into his house, I closed the front door and stood in my entryway for a long moment. The coffee in my mug had already begun to cool. Daisy brushed against my ankle, meowing impatiently for breakfast, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. I wished I could be as unconcerned as she was. Instead, I found myself staring through the front window toward Walter's dark house. A single light glowed in an upstairs room. That alone felt strange. Walter was usually asleep by 10 o'clock every night. He often joked that retirement had turned him into an old-fashioned farmer who rose with the sun and went to bed shortly after sunset. Yet he had clearly been awake all night. Something about that unsettled me. I tried to shake off the feeling. People have bad nights. People worry. People make strange decisions before sunrise. Still, the conversation lingered in my mind while I fed Daisy and finished my coffee. By 6 o'clock, I was dressed for work. My purse sat on the kitchen table. My car keys rested beside it. Everything was ready. All I had to do was leave. Instead, I found myself sitting quietly at the table, staring at my phone. My accounting office was 23 miles away. If I left by 7, I would arrive comfortably before my shift started. That had been my routine for years. Yet every time I reached for my keys, I heard Walter's voice again. "Stay home today. Just trust me." The words made no sense. That was what bothered me most. If he had claimed there was bad weather coming, I could understand. If he had heard about a road closure or a gas leak or some local emergency, I could understand. But he had offered nothing. No explanation. No evidence. Just a warning. I looked out the kitchen window again. Walter's curtains remained closed. Around 7:15, I finally picked up my phone and called the office. My manager, Lisa Harmon, answered on the second ring. Margaret? Everything okay? I hesitated. I almost laughed at how ridiculous I sounded. I am not feeling quite right this morning, I said. I think I should stay home. Lisa immediately told me not to worry and wished me well. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When I hung up, I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt guilty. I rarely missed work. Even after my husband died, I had returned after only a short leave because routine helped me cope. Sitting at home while everyone else worked felt wrong. The morning stretched on. I watered the flowers on my back porch. I folded laundry. I watched a local news program. Yet I could not focus on any of it. Around 9:30, I noticed something unusual. Walter was standing by his living room window. He was not reading. He was not watching television. He appeared to be watching the street. Every few minutes he glanced toward my house. When he noticed me looking, he stepped away from the window. A chill moved through me despite the warm spring air. Walter knew something. I was certain of it now. The question was whether he was protecting me from a real danger or from a fear that existed only in his mind. At that moment, I still believed there was a good chance that by evening I would laugh about all of this and return to work the next day. I had no way of knowing that the clock was quietly moving toward noon, and with every passing minute, the answer I had been searching for was getting closer. At 10:30, I gave up pretending I could concentrate on anything productive. The laundry sat half-folded on the couch. A crossword puzzle remained unfinished on the kitchen table. Even Daisy seemed annoyed by my restless pacing. Every room in the house felt smaller than usual, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. I finally made myself a second cup of coffee and settled into the recliner near the front window. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson was trimming flowers in her yard. A delivery truck rolled through the neighborhood. Everything looked ordinary, yet the uneasiness inside me refused to fade. Around 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text message from my coworker, Denise. You picked a good day to stay home. The office is a circus. I stared at the message. Denise rarely complained. Curious, I asked what she meant. A few minutes later, she replied, a bunch of unfamiliar people have been coming in and out since this morning. Nobody is telling us much. Management keeps having closed-door meetings. I read the message twice. It should not have meant anything. Offices have busy days. Unexpected visitors arrive all the time. Still, I felt that same knot tighten in my stomach. I thought about calling Walter. Instead, I walked to the front door and stepped outside. The spring air felt warmer now. Sunlight filled the street. For a moment, I considered walking next door and demanding answers. Before I could move, Walter appeared on his porch. He noticed me immediately. Neither of us spoke. He simply raised a hand in greeting. His expression looked tired. Not frightened exactly. More like someone carrying a burden alone for too long. Walter, I called. You are going to tell me what this is all about eventually. He nodded once. I know. Then why not now? He looked toward the road before answering. Because I am still hoping I am wrong. Those words stayed with me long after I went back inside. Hoping I am wrong. It was not the response of someone spreading rumors or imagining problems. It sounded like the response of a man who had seen pieces of a puzzle but could not yet see the entire picture. The clock on my microwave slowly ticked toward noon. 11:47. 11:52. 11:58. I found myself staring at the digital numbers as if they mattered. Then, at exactly 12 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Denise's name. The moment I answered, I knew something had changed. Her voice sounded strained. Not panicked. Not frantic. Just stunned. Margaret, she said quietly, are you sitting down? My grip tightened around the phone. The room suddenly felt very still. Outside, a lawn mower hummed somewhere in the distance. Inside, even Daisy stopped moving. What happened? I asked. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Denise said something that made my blood run cold. In that instant, I finally understood why Walter had come to my door before sunrise. For a second, I could not speak. Denise's words echoed in my ears while I stared at the wall across from me. According to her, several federal investigators had arrived at the office shortly after 11:30. Entire departments had been asked to stop working. Computers were being reviewed. Records were being examined. Senior management had been escorted into private conference rooms for questioning. No one outside the company had seen it coming. Margaret, They are saying this has been building for months, Denise said. Nobody understands everything yet. I slowly sat down in the kitchen chair. The coffee beside me had gone cold hours earlier. Is everyone okay? I asked quietly. Yes, Denise replied. Everyone is fine. Just shocked. They keep asking questions about financial reports and account transfers. My stomach tightened. Financial reports. Account transfers. Suddenly, small memories began surfacing in my mind. Tiny details I had ignored. Strange requests from management. Files that had been moved unexpectedly. Reports that disappeared and then reappeared days later with revised numbers. At the time, I assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Large companies were complicated. Mistakes happened. Yet now those memories felt different, like puzzle pieces waiting to be connected. After I ended the call, I remained motionless for several minutes. The house felt impossibly quiet. Then I looked through the front window toward Walter's home. The curtain moved slightly. He was watching, not spying. Watching, waiting, almost as if he already knew I had received the call. I grabbed my sweater and walked outside. My pulse quickened with every step across the grass. Walter opened his front door before I even reached the porch. He looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. You know something? I said. It was not a question. Walter nodded slowly. A little. How? He gestured toward the living room. Come inside. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Family photographs lined the shelves. I had been inside his house only a handful of times over the years, usually for neighborhood gatherings or holiday visits. Today felt different. Today felt serious. Walter sat in his armchair and folded his hands together. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at me. Do you remember that white delivery van that kept parking near the office building? I frowned. The question caught me off guard. The one that showed up every few weeks? He nodded. I noticed it months ago. I stared at him. My office was nearly 23 miles away. How would you notice that? A faint smile crossed his face. Because I was there. My confusion deepened. Walter leaned back and exhaled slowly. Margaret, there are things I have not told anyone. Things about where I spend my time and why I pay attention to certain details. He paused before continuing. The truth is, this did not start this morning. It started nearly 6 months ago. As he spoke those words, I realized the mystery was much bigger than a single warning before sunrise. Walter had been carrying a secret for a very long time, and somehow that secret had become connected to my life. Walter rubbed his hands together and stared at the floor for a moment before speaking again. After I retired from the fire department, I started volunteering with a community oversight group. Nothing official, just retired professionals helping local organizations identify safety concerns and unusual activity. It gave me something useful to do. I listened carefully. None of this was what I expected to hear. Walter continued. About 6 months ago, I was attending a meeting in a building across from your office complex. While I was there, I noticed certain patterns. He paused. The same vehicles arriving at odd hours. Deliveries that did not match the businesses listed in the directory. Visitors who never seemed to check in properly. I frowned. And you thought something was wrong? I thought something was unusual, he corrected gently. There is a difference. He stood and walked to a bookshelf. From a drawer beneath it, he removed a small notebook. The pages were filled with dates, times, and handwritten observations. Walter handed it to me. My eyes widened. Some entries stretched back months. Others mentioned locations around my office building. You kept records? I asked. He nodded. Old habits. Firefighters learn to notice details. Sometimes details matter. I slowly turned another page. Everything appeared organized and methodical. Nothing felt dramatic or paranoid. That made it even more unsettling. Did you show this to anyone? I asked. Eventually. Walter sat back down. A few weeks ago, I contacted someone I trust. A former colleague who now works with a federal agency. I told him I might be overreacting, but I wanted another opinion. My pulse quickened. And Walter exhaled slowly. At first, they thought it was probably nothing. Then they started looking. Quietly. The room seemed smaller. Suddenly Denise's phone call made more sense. The closed meetings. The investigators. The questions about financial records. Walter had not caused any of it. He had simply noticed pieces of something larger before anyone else did. Why did you not tell me? I asked softly. His expression changed. Genuine regret crossed his face. Because I did not know enough. Imagine if I had come to you 3 months ago and told you I had a feeling something strange was happening near your office. What could you have done with that information? I knew he was right. I would have dismissed it. Most people would have. Walter leaned forward. Then yesterday evening I received a phone call. My attention sharpened immediately. From your friend? He nodded. He could not share details. But he told me there would be activity at your office today. Significant activity. Walter looked directly into my eyes. He also said employees would likely be interviewed throughout the day. Some people might find themselves caught in situations they never expected. I swallowed hard. You thought I could become involved? I thought you could become overwhelmed by something you had no role in creating. His voice remained calm. You have already been through enough in your life, Margaret. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Sunlight streamed through the living room window. Outside, children rode bicycles down the street. The world looked completely normal. Yet inside Walter's house, everything felt different now. The mystery was beginning to take shape. But one question still remained. If Walter had only received the warning yesterday evening, what had kept him awake all night staring out his window before finally coming to my door at 5 in the morning? Walter looked away toward the window. For the first time since I had entered his house, he seemed uncertain. That alone caught my attention. He had spent the entire afternoon speaking calmly, choosing every word carefully. Now he appeared uncomfortable. Because I almost convinced myself not to come, he said quietly. I frowned. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. My friend never told me anyone was in danger. He never told me to warn you. In fact, he specifically avoided discussing details. I waited. Then why did you? Walter stared out the window at the street beyond. Because sometimes information is not the only thing that matters. Sometimes experience matters too. He pointed toward the notebook resting on the coffee table. For 40 years I walked into situations where something felt wrong before I could explain why. Most of the time nothing happened. But every once in a while, that feeling turned out to matter. I remembered the expression on his face before sunrise. The exhaustion. The tension. The way he kept glancing toward the street. You were worried about me. He nodded. More than I wanted to admit. A strange silence settled between us. I realized how unusual this entire situation truly was. Walter and I had been neighbors for more than 2 decades. We exchanged Christmas cards. We watched each other's houses during vacations. We occasionally shared coffee on weekends. But we were not family. Yet somehow he had spent an entire sleepless night worrying about whether I would leave for work that morning. The thought touched me more deeply than I expected. What kept you awake? I finally asked. Walter smiled faintly. You want the honest answer? Yes. I kept imagining you walking into a situation you knew nothing about. He rubbed his forehead. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Then I told myself it was none of my business. Then I remembered something my captain used to say. I waited. If you can prevent a bad day for someone, even a small one, you do it. You never regret trying. I looked down at my hands. The simplicity of that statement struck me. In a world where most people rush through their lives barely noticing their neighbors, Walter had chosen to act. Maybe he had not known exactly what would happen. Maybe he had not even been certain anything would happen. But he cared enough to knock on my door anyway. Just then my phone buzzed again. Another message from Denise. I opened it immediately. The text was brief. Management had announced that several long-running financial irregularities had been discovered. Outside investigators had been quietly reviewing records for months. Employees who had no involvement would eventually return to normal operations, but the office would remain closed for several days. I stared at the message. Several months. The exact timeline Walter had mentioned. Slowly, the final pieces began sliding into place. What started as a collection of strange observations had grown into something much larger. Yet one detail still bothered me. I looked back at Walter. There is something I still do not understand. He raised an eyebrow. What is that? I took a deep breath. How did you know to warn me today, and not yesterday, or next week? For the first time all afternoon, Walter's expression changed completely. The answer, whatever it was, clearly mattered. And judging by the look in his eyes, it was a story I had never heard before. Walter remained silent for several seconds. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked steadily between us. Finally, he stood up and walked toward the bookshelf again. This time he removed a framed photograph. I recognized the younger version of Walter immediately. He was wearing a firefighter uniform, standing beside a group of men and women who looked proud, tired, and determined. Walter held the photograph carefully before handing it to me. The man on the far left was named Frank Delaney, he said. He was one of the best people I ever worked with. I studied the picture. Frank looked to be in his 40s, smiling confidently at the camera. What happened to him? I asked. Walter sat back down slowly. 20 years ago, Frank noticed several warning signs before a major warehouse fire. Nothing dramatic, just little things that did not seem right. Equipment moved where it should not have been. Strange smells. Odd maintenance records. Walter's voice softened. He mentioned his concerns, but nobody took them seriously, including me. I could already tell where the story was going. A week later, there was a fire? Walter nodded once. Frank was right. He had seen the clues before anyone else. Afterward, I promised myself something. If I ever felt strongly enough that something was wrong, I would speak up, even if I sounded foolish. He looked directly at me. Yesterday afternoon, when my friend called, I remembered Frank. The room fell quiet again. Walter continued. My friend never asked me to warn you. He never suggested that you were personally at risk. But when I put together everything I had observed over the past 6 months, I could not stop thinking about the possibility that you would walk into a situation that could turn your entire life upside down. I understood now. This was not about danger in the dramatic sense. It was about consequences, confusion, stress, endless interviews and questions, being pulled into something you never created. Walter had wanted to spare me from that if he could. So you trusted your instincts, I said. He smiled faintly. For once. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Denise. This one was longer. Several employees had already been contacted by investigators. Not because they were suspected of wrongdoing, but because they might have handled documents connected to the ongoing review. Denise herself expected to spend hours answering questions over the coming days. I read the message twice. Then I slowly lowered the phone. Had I gone to work that morning, I would have been sitting in that office when everything unfolded. I would have been anxious, confused, and caught in the middle of events I barely understood. Walter watched my expression. Now you see why I came to your door. I nodded. Yes. But as I looked at him, another realization settled over me. The most remarkable part of this story was not the investigation. It was not the records, or the questions, or the months of hidden activity. It was the fact that one neighbor cared enough to act when everyone else would have stayed silent. And somehow, I had a feeling that this was not the end of the story. It was only the moment when I finally understood how much one simple act of kindness could change the course of a person's life. The next few days passed more quietly than I expected. News about the investigation spread throughout town, but very few details became public. Most people filled the gaps with rumors. Some claimed the company would close permanently. Others insisted everything would return to normal within weeks. I stopped paying attention to the speculation. After everything that had happened, I found myself thinking less about the office and more about Walter. Before that morning, I had viewed him the way most neighbors view each other. Friendly, reliable, familiar. Now I saw him differently. One afternoon, 3 days after the investigators arrived, I was sitting on my porch when a dark sedan pulled into Walter's driveway. A man in his 50s stepped out carrying a briefcase. He wore no uniform, but there was something professional about him. Walter greeted him at the door, and the two disappeared inside. Nearly 2 hours later, the visitor left. As he drove away, Walter walked across the lawn toward me. Your friend? I asked. He nodded. The one who called. Yes. I studied his expression. Good news or bad news? Walter sat down in the empty chair beside me. Mostly good. The answer surprised me. He explained that the review of company records had uncovered problems that were already being corrected. Many employees, including Denise and me, had done nothing wrong. In fact, investigators had specifically noted that several staff members had consistently followed procedures despite confusing instructions from higher management. Hearing that lifted a weight I had not realized I was carrying. So everything will be okay? I asked. Walter smiled. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Children played basketball farther down the street. A breeze moved through the maple trees lining the sidewalk. For the first time all week, the neighborhood felt normal again. Then Walter surprised me. Do you know what bothered me most? He asked. I shook my head. Not the possibility that something was wrong. It was the possibility that I might stay quiet. I looked at him carefully. You really thought about not coming? He nodded. several times. His honesty caught me off guard. Most people prefer stories where courage appears instantly. Walter's story was different. He had been uncertain. He had doubted himself. He had worried about looking foolish. Yet he knocked on my door anyway. Somehow that made his decision more meaningful. A few days later, I returned to work. The atmosphere was different. Quieter. More cautious. But it was also more honest. As I walked through the office that morning, Denise smiled and hugged me. "You picked the perfect day to stay home," she said. I smiled back, thinking about the man living next door. She was right. I had stayed home. But not because I was lucky. Not because I was clever. I stayed home because someone cared enough to act when every reason in the world told him to mind his own business. And standing there in that office, I finally realized that the smallest decisions often leave the biggest marks on our lives. Several months later, life had settled into a new rhythm. The investigation was largely behind us. The office remained open, although many procedures had changed. New managers had arrived. New safeguards had been introduced. Most people wanted to forget the entire experience and move on. I understood that feeling, yet I could not forget one detail. Every morning when I left for work, I glanced toward Walter's house. It had become a habit, not because I expected another mystery, not because I feared something unusual was about to happen. I did it because I had gained a deeper appreciation for something I had taken for granted for years. One Saturday morning in early autumn, I found Walter sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee. The maple trees along our street had begun turning shades of gold and red. The air carried that crisp feeling that always arrives before winter. I walked over and handed him a small paper bag. "What is this?" he asked. "Open it." Inside was a framed photograph. Not of his fire department crew. Not of his family. It was a picture of our street. A simple photograph taken at sunrise. Two houses standing side by side beneath a bright morning sky. Walter stared at it for a long moment before smiling. "I do not understand." "You will," I said. He looked at me expectantly. I took a breath. For years, I thought home was just a place. For walls. A roof. Familiar rooms. Then I realized something. Home is also the people who look out for you when they do not have to. Walter's eyes softened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply sat there watching leaves drift across the sidewalk. Eventually, he laughed quietly. "You are making me sound more heroic than I am." "No," I replied. "I am giving credit where it belongs." The truth was simple. Walter never claimed to have special knowledge. He never pretended to predict the future. He never asked for recognition. He saw a possibility. He trusted his experience. Most importantly, he cared enough to act. That was all. Yet sometimes all is more than enough. As the months passed, our friendship grew stronger. We shared meals occasionally. We helped each other with small household projects. We checked in after storms. The kind of ordinary things neighbors used to do more often. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Walter had stayed silent that morning. Maybe everything would have worked out the same way. Maybe not. The point is that I will never know. What I do know is this. In a world where people are often encouraged to mind their own business, one retired firefighter chose kindness over convenience. He chose concern over comfort. He chose action over silence. And because of that choice, I learned something valuable. The people who change our lives are not always relatives. They are not always lifelong friends. Sometimes they are simply the person living next door. The person who notices. The person who cares. The person willing to knock on your door before sunrise because something in their heart tells them they should. Even now, whenever I see the photograph sitting on Walter's bookshelf, I smile. Because every time I look at it, I remember that the most important warning I ever received was not really about a workplace or an investigation. It was a reminder that kindness still exists, often in the quietest places, waiting for someone brave enough to act on it.